Hello everyone. Tonight we travel back to a quiet medieval village where something unusual happened every evening. Long before the sky turned completely dark, doors were already locked, shutters sealed, and the streets suddenly fell silent. But why were villagers so determined to secure their homes before sunset? What did they know about the coming night that made them hurry indoors so early? Stay with me as we slowly uncover the quiet fears and hidden dangers that waited outside those wooden doors. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon in a medieval village, a quiet but noticeable shift would take place among the people who lived there. Farmers returning from the fields quickened their pace. Merchants finished their final transactions in the market square, and mothers called their children back from playing in the dusty village paths. The fading light was not merely the end of another workday. It was a signal that safety would soon become uncertain. Long before night fully arrived, villagers began securing their homes, sliding heavy wooden bolts across doors and closing shutters tightly over windows. Locking the door before sunset was not simply a habit. It was a survival instinct shaped by the realities of medieval life. One of the biggest reasons villagers locked their doors early was the absence of organized law enforcement. In many small settlements, there were no professional guards patrolling the streets throughout the night. Some larger towns might have had watchmen or night patrols, but even these were limited and often unreliable. In small villages, people were mostly responsible for their own protection. If trouble came after dark, help might be far away or too slow to arrive. Because of this, households took precautions before darkness set in, ensuring their doors were secured while there was still enough light to move around safely and confirm everything was properly locked. Travelers and strangers were another source of uncertainty. Roads in medieval times were often dangerous, and not everyone traveling through a village had good intentions. Bandits, thieves, deserters from armies, or wandering criminals sometimes passed through rural settlements, looking for easy opportunities. A house left unsecured could quickly become a target. Villagers knew that once darkness fell, identifying strangers became difficult. Someone knocking on a door after sunset could be anyone, and opening it without caution could invite serious danger. The design of medieval houses also made them vulnerable. Most homes were constructed from timber frames filled with wattle and daub, with simple wooden doors and shutters. These structures provided basic shelter but not strong defense. Doors were usually reinforced with wooden beams or iron latches on the inside, and these could only be secured effectively when the household was prepared. By locking the door before sunset, families ensured they would not need to open it again once night made visibility poor and risks higher. Wild animals were another concern, especially in villages located near forests or open countryside. Wolves, wild dogs, boars, and other animals sometimes wandered close to human settlements after dark in search of food. Livestock such as chickens, goats, and pigs were valuable assets for villagers, and predators could easily attack animals left unprotected. By closing doors and gates early, households protected both themselves and their animals from unwanted nighttime visitors. Lighting also played a major role in this routine. Medieval villages had no street lights, and once the sun set, the landscape could become almost completely dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight or scattered lanterns. Inside homes, lighting came from candles, oil lamps, or hearth fires, which were expensive or limited resources. Moving around outside in darkness was difficult and sometimes dangerous because people could trip, fall, or become lost. Locking doors before sunset allowed villagers to finish their outdoor tasks while there was still enough natural light to do so safely. Fear of theft was constant in medieval communities because most people lived with very few possessions, and losing even a small item could be devastating. Food supplies stored for winter, tools used for farming, and clothing were essential for survival. Thieves often targeted villages at night because the darkness gave them cover. A door left unlocked could mean the loss of grain sacks, cooking pots, or even animals kept near the house. Villagers therefore took the precaution of securing everything early, so that opportunistic thieves would find no easy entry. Community customs also reinforced the habit of locking doors early. In many villages there was an unspoken understanding that once evening arrived, social activity outside would decrease. People gathered inside their homes with family members rather than wandering the streets. Visitors typically arrived earlier in the day, and arriving after sunset could raise suspicion. This social rhythm created a shared expectation that doors would be closed and households would settle in before darkness fully arrived. Weather conditions also contributed to this routine. Medieval Europe and other regions with similar village structures often experienced cold nights, strong winds, and sudden storms. Closing doors and shutters before sunset helped preserve warmth from the hearth fire and kept rain or wind from entering the house. Wooden doors and shutters served as barriers not only against people and animals, but also against the elements. Religious and cultural beliefs sometimes intensified these precautions as well. Many villagers believed that nighttime was associated with danger beyond the physical world. Stories about spirits, demons, witches, or supernatural forces were common in medieval folklore. While such beliefs varied from region to region, they reinforced the idea that darkness was a time when people should remain indoors and protected. Locking the door symbolized both physical safety and a sense of spiritual protection. Another practical reason involved the structure of village life itself. Most communities were small and closely connected, meaning everyone generally knew each other. If someone was outside after dark wandering near houses, it would quickly attract attention and suspicion. Locking doors early helped maintain a clear boundary between the safety of the household and the uncertainty outside. Families gathered around the hearth, shared meals, repaired tools, told stories, or prayed together while the night passed. Village layouts also influenced this behavior. Many settlements were surrounded by fields, forests, or rough terrain rather than walls or fortifications. Larger towns sometimes had gates that were closed at night, but small villages rarely had such defences. Individual homes therefore acted as the primary line of protection. Securing doors before sunset ensured that each household functioned as its own safe space within the wider community. There was also the matter of fire safety. Because most houses relied on open hearths or simple fireplaces for cooking and heating, sparks and embers could easily spread if doors or windows were left open. By closing everything before evening, families could better control airflow and reduce the risk of flames spreading through the wooden structures that made up much of the village. In addition, locking doors early helped establish a clear daily rhythm that matched the natural cycle of daylight. Medieval life was deeply connected to the rising and setting of the sun. Without electric lighting or modern technology, people structured their work, meals, and rest around daylight hours. Finishing tasks and securing the home before sunset allowed villagers to transition smoothly into the quieter nighttime routine of rest and recovery for the next day's labor. Children were often taught from a young age about the importance of returning home before the sun disappeared. Parents reminded them that once the sky darkened, the village paths were no longer safe places to wander. These lessons were passed down through generations, reinforcing habits that protected the entire community. The simple act of sliding a wooden bolt across a door each evening carried deep meaning in medieval life. It represented the boundary between the unpredictable world outside and the small zone of safety inside the home. Within those walls, families could relax, share food, and sleep knowing they had done what they could to guard themselves from the dangers of the night. Although modern villages and towns now rely on streetlights, police forces, and advanced security systems, the medieval practice of locking doors before sunset reminds us how different daily life once was. For villagers centuries ago, the fading daylight was not merely the end of a day's work, but a warning that the night belonged to uncertainty. By securing their homes early, they created a fragile but vital sense of protection in a world where safety was never guaranteed. As evening shadows stretched across the fields and narrow dirt roads of a medieval village, the routine of preparing for night became almost ritualistic. People who spent the day working outside knew that once darkness settled, the village environment transformed into something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous. Unlike modern communities filled with lights and constant activity, medieval villages became extremely quiet and dark at night. The safest place a person could be after sunset was inside their own home, behind a closed and secured door. For this reason, villagers did not wait until complete darkness to lock up. Instead, they secured their homes before sunset, while they could still see clearly and make sure everything was in order. Another factor that influenced this habit was the unpredictable movement of soldiers and armed groups during the medieval period. In times of political instability, small groups of soldiers, mercenaries or deserters sometimes moved across the countryside looking for food, shelter, or valuables. Villages were easy targets because they were usually unprotected and filled with basic supplies like grain, livestock, and tools. Even if these armed men did not intend to attack, their presence alone created fear among villagers. By locking doors before sunset, families ensured that if unfamiliar groups passed through the area. In many medieval villages, the habit of locking doors before sunset was deeply tied to the fragile nature of daily survival. Life in these communities depended heavily on routine, caution, and awareness of the environment. Villagers understood that once darkness arrived, their ability to control or predict events outside their homes diminished dramatically. Because of this, preparing for night became a careful process that started before the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Locking the door was one of the most important steps in that preparation. Many villages were located far from major towns or castles. meaning they had little immediate protection if trouble occurred. Communication between settlements could take hours or even days, and help from authorities was rarely quick. If bandits or hostile travelers appeared during the night, villagers often had no one to rely on except themselves and their neighbors. This constant awareness encouraged families to secure their homes early, ensuring that they would not need to step outside again. Once darkness fell, another important reason involved the nature of medieval travel. Roads during this period were often poorly maintained and passed through forests, fields, and isolated countryside. Travelers who failed to reach a safe place before sunset sometimes continued moving through the night, hoping to find shelter or a village where they could rest. However, villagers were cautious about strangers arriving after dark. Without clear identification, it was impossible to know whether a traveller was simply seeking shelter or looking for an opportunity to steal. By locking their doors before sunset, families avoided situations where they might be pressured to open their homes to unknown individuals during the night. The architecture of medieval houses also influenced these habits. Doors were often thick wooden planks, reinforced with iron hinges, and secured by heavy beams or bolts on the inside. These locking systems worked best when they were put in place calmly and carefully while there was still daylight. Trying to secure a door quickly in complete darkness could lead to mistakes, leaving gaps or weak points that intruders might exploit. Villagers preferred to secure their homes before nightfall, so they could confirm that everything was properly fastened. Night in a medieval village was not only dark but also incredibly quiet. Without modern machines, vehicles, or electric lights, the countryside after sunset could feel almost silent, except for natural sounds like wind, insects, or distant animals. This silence made unusual noises easier to detect, but it also made people more sensitive to the unknown. A creaking fence, footsteps on gravel, or the distant howl of an animal could easily stir anxiety. A locked door helped provide reassurance that whatever sounds came from outside would remain outside. Food storage was another major concern that encouraged villagers to lock their homes early. Many families kept sacks of grain, dried meat, cheese, or vegetables stored inside their houses or in nearby sheds. These supplies were essential for surviving winter months or times when crops failed. Because food had such value, it was often a target for theft. A burglar could cause serious damage to a household simply by stealing stored provisions. Securing the door before nightfall reduced the risk that someone might quietly slip inside and take what little the family had. Village animals also influenced how homes were secured. Dogs were sometimes kept as basic guards, alerting families if strangers approached the house during the night. However, even dogs could not always stop determined intruders. Locking the door created a physical barrier that worked together with the dog's warning. If barking was heard outside, the family knew their door was already secured, giving them time to react without panic. Another aspect of medieval life that shaped this practice was the lack of glass windows in many homes. Instead of glass panes, windows were often covered with wooden shutters, cloth, or animal skins to keep out wind and rain. These coverings could be opened during the day for light and air, but were usually closed before sunset. Once shutters were closed and doors were bolted, the house became a sealed environment designed to protect the family through the night. Locking the door was therefore part of a larger routine that included closing shutters, banking the fire, and bringing tools or belongings indoors. Community trust also played an interesting role in the evening routine. During the day, villagers depended on cooperation with neighbours for farming, building, and sharing resources. But when night arrived, even trusted communities recognized that caution was necessary. Locking doors did not mean villagers distrusted one another. Rather, it reflected the understanding that nighttime created opportunities for outsiders to move unnoticed. Maintaining a secure household helped protect not only one family, but the stability of the entire village. In many places, village bells or church bells marked the passage of time and signalled when evening approached. These sounds served as reminders that people should finish their tasks and prepare for night. When the bell rang, or when the sky began turning deep orange and purple, villagers knew it was time to return home. Doors were shut, shutters closed, and tools stored safely away. This daily rhythm created a sense of order that helped communities function smoothly. Children often experienced this routine as one of the earliest lessons in responsibility and safety. As they grew older, they were given small tasks such as bringing animals into pens, gathering firewood, or helping secure the shutters. Through these activities, they learned the importance of preparing the home before darkness arrived. Locking the door became not only a practical action, but also a symbol of family unity and protection. Even the emotional atmosphere inside the house changed. Once the door was secured, the outside world, with all its uncertainties, was left beyond the threshold. Inside, the warmth of the hearth fire created a space where family members could relax and talk quietly. Some evenings were spent repairing tools or weaving cloth, while others were devoted to storytelling or prayer. The locked door provided a sense of peace that allowed villagers to rest after long days of labour. Natural threats also remained a constant concern in rural areas. Heavy rain, strong winds, or sudden storms could appear during the night, especially in certain seasons. Closing doors and shutters early helped prevent damage from weather and kept the interior of the house warm and dry. In this way, locking the door served not only as protection from people and animals, but also from the unpredictable forces of nature. Over time, these habits became traditions passed down from generation to generation. Even when circumstances improved, or when villages became slightly more secure, the practice remained deeply rooted in daily life. Villagers understood from experience that caution was far better than regret. A door locked before sunset required only a moment of effort, but leaving it unsecured could lead to consequences that might take months or years to recover from. Looking back today, the medieval habit of locking doors before sunset reveals how carefully people adapted to the challenges of their environment. Without modern security systems, police protection, or reliable lighting, villagers relied on simple but effective routines to keep themselves safe. The act of securing the door was a small gesture, yet it carried enormous importance. It represented preparation, responsibility, and the desire to protect family and home from the dangers that often accompanied the arrival of night. As daylight slowly faded over a medieval village, the atmosphere often changed in ways that modern people might find difficult to imagine. The countryside was not filled with the constant glow of electric lights or the distant sounds of traffic. Instead, the world became darker and quieter with every passing minute. Villagers understood that once the sun disappeared, their surroundings would transform into a place where visibility was limited and uncertainty increased. For this reason, locking the door before sunset became a deeply ingrained habit that provided both physical security and psychological comfort. Many villagers believed that night naturally belonged to danger. Even if nothing threatening appeared most evenings, the possibility always existed. Rural communities were surrounded by forests, hills, and open land where people rarely travelled after dark. If someone approached a house during the night, it was often unexpected and suspicious. A locked door ensured that the family inside would not be caught unprepared if such a situation occurred. Another factor that encouraged early door locking was the importance of maintaining control over the household space. In medieval society, the home was not only a place to sleep, but also the centre of family life and economic survival. Tools used for farming, spinning wheels for making cloth, cooking utensils, and food supplies were all kept inside the house or in nearby storage areas. Losing access to these items due to theft or intrusion could disrupt the entire household. Locking the door before sunset was a way of protecting the tools and resources that kept the family functioning. The evening routine often began while there was still light in the sky. Villagers would collect anything left outside that might attract attention or be stolen. Wooden carts, farming tools, buckets and baskets were brought indoors or placed in secure sheds. Animals were fed and placed in enclosures. Fires were prepared for cooking the evening meal. Once these tasks were finished, the door was closed and secured. As evening settled over a medieval village, the gradual fading of sunlight brought with it a powerful sense of urgency. People who had spent the day working outdoors understood that night would soon change the entire atmosphere of their surroundings. During daylight hours, the village was a place of movement and cooperation. Farmers worked in fields, craftsmen laboured in workshops, children played along dusty paths, and neighbours exchanged news in open spaces. But as the sun lowered toward the horizon, activity began to slow. The golden light of late afternoon served as a reminder that it was time to finish tasks and prepare for the coming darkness. The process of securing the home usually began well before the last light disappeared. Families gathered tools that had been used during the day and brought them inside or placed them in storage sheds. These tools were often handmade and extremely valuable, sometimes passed down through generations. Losing them to theft or damage could seriously disrupt a family's ability to work. Because of this, villagers were careful to ensure that everything important was protected before the night began. In many medieval homes, the door itself was one of the strongest parts of the structure. While walls were often made of timber frames filled with mud or straw mixtures, doors were usually constructed from thick wooden planks reinforced with iron nails or straps. Some doors even had heavy crossbars that could be placed across the inside for additional security. Locking such doors required effort and attention, which is why villagers preferred to secure them, while there was still enough light to see clearly. Another reason villagers locked their doors before sunset was the constant possibility of wandering animals entering the house. Livestock such as chickens or pigs sometimes moved freely around the village during the day. If doors were left open into the evening, animals could easily wander inside, searching for food or warmth. Once inside, they could cause chaos by knocking over objects or eating stored supplies. Closing and securing the door early helped prevent these disruptions. Nighttime temperatures also influenced this habit. In many regions, medieval evenings could become quite cold, especially during autumn and winter. Keeping doors closed helped trap the warmth produced by the hearth fire, which was usually the main source of heat in the home. Allowing cold air to enter after sunset would make the interior uncomfortable and require more firewood to maintain warmth. Since gathering firewood required significant effort, conserving heat was extremely important. There was also the matter of personal vulnerability during the night. If someone knocked on the door after dark, villagers had to make difficult decisions about whether to respond. Opening the door without knowing who stood outside could be dangerous. Yet ignoring someone might leave a traveller in distress. By locking doors before sunset and discouraging late arrivals, villagers reduced the likelihood of facing such uncertain situations. Most travellers understood this custom and tried to reach a place of shelter before nightfall. The lack of reliable nighttime navigation further reinforced the importance of staying indoors. Without lanterns bright enough to illuminate long distances, even familiar paths could become confusing in the dark. A person walking between houses might lose their way or stumble into obstacles. Because of these difficulties, villagers preferred to complete all movement between homes while daylight remained. In addition, medieval villages often relied on shared responsibility for safety. If one household noticed suspicious activity, they might alert neighbours by shouting or ringing a bell. However, this system worked best when everyone was already indoors and attentive. When doors were locked and families gathered inside, they could respond quickly to warnings. Leaving doors open late into the evening disrupted this protective rhythm and made coordination more difficult. Cultural traditions also played a role in shaping how villagers approached the transition from day to night. Many communities viewed sunset as a symbolic boundary between the active world of labour and the quieter world of rest. The act of closing and locking the door marked this transition. It was a signal that the day's responsibilities were complete and that the family could now focus on the activities that filled the evening hours. Inside the house, the atmosphere often became calm and intimate. The glow of the fire illuminated the room, casting soft shadows on wooden walls and beams. People spoke more quietly than they did during the day, partly because of the peaceful setting and partly because voices carried easily in the stillness of night. With the door locked, the family could focus on their own small world without worrying about unexpected interruptions. The habit of locking doors before sunset also reflected the broader uncertainty of medieval life. Villagers faced many challenges, including crop failures, disease, political conflicts, and harsh weather. Because so many aspects of life were unpredictable, people valued routines that provided a sense of stability. Securing the home each evening became one of those routines, offering reassurance that at least some dangers could be controlled. Over time, this practice became deeply embedded in the culture of rural communities. Even when conditions improved or when villages grew larger and more organized, the habit continued. It had been proven effective for generations, and there was little reason to abandon it. Parents taught their children to check the door at dusk, just as naturally as they taught them to tend the animals or maintain the fire. The locked door also carried symbolic meaning beyond its practical function. It represented the boundary between the family and the outside world, Inside the door were people bound together by shared responsibilities, traditions, and affection. Outside lay a wider world that could sometimes be unpredictable or even hostile. Securing that boundary each evening reinforced the importance of protecting the household. When viewed from a modern perspective, the simple act of locking a door before sunset might appear overly cautious. Yet for medieval villagers, it was one of the most sensible and reliable ways to reduce risk. Without organized policing, modern infrastructure, or advanced security systems, families relied on habits that had proven effective over centuries. As darkness spread across fields and forests, the village slowly settled into quiet stillness. One by one, the lights of hearth fires flickered behind closed shutters. Doors remained firmly bolted, and the outside paths fell silent, except for the occasional sound of wind or distant animals. Within each home, families rested knowing they had taken the necessary steps to protect themselves. In this way, the simple routine of locking the door before sunset became a cornerstone of medieval daily life. It combined practicality, caution, and tradition into a single action that helped families face the long hours of darkness with a greater sense of safety and peace. As the medieval day slowly approached its end, villagers instinctively began preparing for the shift from daylight activity to nighttime caution. The sun was not just a source of light, but also the natural boundary that determined how people organized their lives. When daylight faded, the environment changed in ways that made everyday tasks more difficult and the world outside more uncertain. Because of this, the act of locking doors before sunset became an essential habit that villagers rarely ignored. An important reason for this practice was the unpredictability of the countryside surrounding most villages. Medieval settlements were often located near forests, hills, marshes, or open farmland. These landscapes were beautiful during the day, but far less friendly after dark. Travelers sometimes got lost. Criminals used the darkness to move unnoticed, and animals left their hiding places to search for food. Villagers knew that when darkness covered the land, they could no longer see what might be approaching their homes. Locking the door early ensured that the household would not be exposed to whatever might wander through the village during the night. Many medieval villagers also understood that darkness affected human behavior. People who might appear harmless during the day could behave differently when hidden by night. A stranger walking through the village in daylight could be seen clearly and questioned by locals. At night, however, it was easier for someone to move quietly between houses without being recognized. The simple barrier of a locked door made it far more difficult for such individuals to attempt entry. The evening routine in most households followed a predictable order. After returning from the fields or workshops, villagers prepared their final tasks of the day. Water might be collected from a nearby well, animals fed, and cooking fires prepared for the evening meal. As these activities ended, someone in the household would walk to the door, close it firmly, and secure the latch or wooden beam. This moment often symbolized that the outside world was now separated from the inside. The importance of this action was understood by everyone in the family. Children were taught that once the door was locked, they should not ask to go outside again, unless there was a serious reason. Stepping outside after dark meant entering a world where visibility was limited, and help might not be available if something went wrong. By staying indoors, families avoided unnecessary risk. Another reason villagers locked their doors before sunset involved the way information spread within small communities. News often travelled by word of mouth. As dusk slowly spread across a medieval village, the change from day to night was something everyone could feel. The sky dimmed, the air cooled, and the familiar sights of the village began to fade into shadows. People who lived in these small communities were very aware that once darkness settled fully, the outside world became far more uncertain. Without strong lighting, reliable guards, or quick ways to call for help, villagers relied on habits and routines that had developed over generations. One of the most important of these habits was locking their doors before the sun had completely disappeared. In many villages, the setting sun acted almost like a signal that the safe hours of the day were ending. Farmers who had spent long hours in the fields began gathering their tools and heading back toward their homes. Craftsmen working in small workshops put away their equipment. Merchants closed stalls in village markets. As people returned home, they knew that only a short window of time remained before darkness made everything more difficult. Locking the door before sunset ensured that families would not have to step outside once the night had fully taken hold. Another reason for this practice was the constant awareness that villages were not isolated from the wider world. Roads connected settlements, and those roads were used by many kinds of travellers. Some were honest merchants or pilgrims, but others were less trustworthy. Bandits, wandering soldiers, or desperate individuals sometimes passed through rural areas looking for food or valuables. Even if such encounters were rare, villagers preferred to take precautions. A closed and bolted door signaled that the household was alert and prepared, discouraging anyone who might consider taking advantage of an unsecured home. The design of medieval settlements also played a role in how people approached nighttime safety. Houses were often built close together along narrow paths or clustered around a central open space. During the day, this arrangement encouraged social interaction and cooperation. Neighbours could easily talk, share tools, or help each other with work. At night, however, the same layout meant that unfamiliar footsteps could echo through the quiet streets. A locked door provided reassurance that any unknown movement outside would remain outside. Many villagers also recognized that night brought a different set of natural sounds and movements. Animals that remained hidden during the day often became active once darkness arrived. Foxes, wolves, and other creatures sometimes approached villages searching for scraps or livestock. Even harmless animals could cause disturbances if they wandered into homes or storage areas. By locking doors early, families protected their homes from both human and animal intruders. The transition from daylight to evening was also closely connected to the rhythm of medieval work and rest. Most labour depended on natural light, and once that light faded, it became difficult to continue working productively. Instead of struggling to complete tasks in darkness, villagers preferred to finish everything while there was still daylight. Locking the door was often the final task that marked the end of the working day. Inside the house, life became quieter and more focused on family activities. The hearth fire provided warmth and a small amount of light, creating a cozy environment where people gathered together. Meals were shared, stories were told, and simple crafts such as sewing or tool repair might continue for a short time. With the door securely locked, the household could enjoy these moments without worrying about unexpected interruptions. Another factor that encouraged early door locking was the limited durability of medieval buildings. Many houses were constructed using materials such as wood, straw, clay, and thatch. While these materials were effective for shelter, they did not provide strong protection against forced entry. A determined intruder could potentially break through weak points if given enough time. Locking the door early ensured that the strongest barrier of the house was already in place before the night began. In some villages, there were also informal expectations about how people should behave once evening arrived. Loud activity outside homes was discouraged, and most residents preferred to remain indoors after dark. This social understanding helped maintain peace and order within the community. Locking doors before sunset reinforced this quiet atmosphere and signaled that the village was settling down for the night. The habit also helped villagers prepare mentally for rest. Life in medieval times required physical labor from sunrise to sunset, and the body needed time to recover. Securing the home created a sense of closure for the day's work. Once the door was locked and the fire was burning steadily, people could finally relax knowing that they had done everything possible to protect themselves and their belongings. For children growing up in these communities, the evening routine became a familiar part of life. They watched adults check the door latch, close shutters, and make sure everything was secure. Over time, they learned that these small actions played an important role in keeping the family safe. When they grew older and had homes of their own, they continued the same practices. In certain regions, seasonal darkness made this habit even more important. During winter months, the sun set much earlier, leaving long hours of darkness. Villagers adapted by finishing their work sooner and securing their homes earlier in the evening. The routine remained consistent regardless of the season, because the risks associated with nighttime never completely disappeared. The act of locking the door also had symbolic meaning. It represented the boundary between the outside world and the private life of the household. Beyond the door were roads, travellers, forests, and unknown possibilities. Inside were family members, warmth, and the small comforts that made life bearable after a hard day of labour. Even though centuries have passed since the medieval period, the image of villagers closing their doors before sunset remains a powerful reminder of how people adapted to the challenges of their time. Without electricity, modern security systems, or reliable law enforcement, they relied on habits that balanced caution with practicality. Each evening, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond fields and hills, wooden doors across the village closed one by one. Bolts slid into place, shutters were fastened, and families gathered around their hearths. Outside, darkness slowly covered the quiet streets, but inside each home there was a small circle of warmth and safety. Through this simple but consistent routine, medieval villagers created a sense of protection in a world that could often feel uncertain. Locking their doors before sunset was not merely a precaution. It was a daily act of responsibility that helped families face the long medieval nights with greater confidence and peace. As the evening sky slowly turned from bright gold to deep shades of orange and purple, medieval villagers knew that the safest part of the day was coming to an end. Daylight brought visibility, familiarity, and the presence of other people working nearby. Night, however, brought uncertainty. The simple act of locking a door before sunset was one of the most practical ways villagers protected themselves in a world where safety depended heavily on preparation and caution. For most villagers, life revolved around agriculture and physical labor. They spent long hours outside tending crops, caring for animals, or working with tools. When evening approached, fatigue from the day's work made people less alert and less able to respond quickly to unexpected threats. Locking the door early ensured that families would not have to deal with sudden disturbances once they were resting or preparing for sleep. Another reason for securing doors before sunset was the limited structure of village defences. Unlike large towns or cities that sometimes had walls and guarded gates, many villages had little protection surrounding them. Open fields and narrow dirt roads connected them to the outside world. Anyone travelling through the countryside could potentially pass through a village without being noticed until they were already close to homes. A locked door created a final layer of protection when the broader environment offered very little security. Villagers were also aware that darkness made it easier for small crimes to occur. Someone could quietly approach a house, test whether the door was open, and leave quickly if they heard movement inside, because most people owned only a few valuable possessions. Even a small theft could have serious consequences. Losing stored grain, tools, or clothing might mean facing great hardship during the coming weeks. Locking the door before sunset greatly reduced the chances of such losses. Even within peaceful villages, the fear of nighttime mischief existed. Occasionally, disputes between individuals or families could lead to acts of revenge or trouble during the night. A locked door served as a barrier that prevented conflicts from escalating into something more dangerous. It gave families a sense that they had created a boundary that others could not easily cross. Another important reason for early door locking involved the difficulty of responding to emergencies in darkness. If a family member needed help, or if a suspicious situation developed outside, villagers preferred to face it while they were prepared, rather than suddenly being caught off guard late at night. By securing the house early and settling inside, they ensured that everyone was present and accounted for before darkness deepened. The sounds of the evening also influenced people's behavior. As the final light of day faded over the rooftops and fields of a medieval village, the act of locking doors before sunset continued to hold great importance in the rhythm of daily life. The villagers had learned through generations of experience that the difference between daylight and darkness was not simply a change in lighting, but a shift in the nature of the world around them. Daytime brought visibility, cooperation, and movement, while nighttime often brought uncertainty, isolation, and vulnerability. Because of this, securing the home before sunset became one of the most dependable ways to maintain a sense of order and safety. Many villagers understood that once darkness arrived, even familiar places could become confusing or difficult to navigate. Paths that were easy to follow during the day could become nearly invisible in the dark. Simple tasks such as walking to a neighbour's house, checking on animals, or retrieving tools from outside could become risky. By locking doors before sunset and finishing outdoor responsibilities early, families ensured that they would not need to move around in dangerous conditions later in the evening. Another reason for the early locking of doors involved the limited ability to defend oneself during the night. In daylight, villagers could recognize danger quickly and gather help from neighbors if needed. But at night, identifying a threat became much harder. A person approaching a house in darkness could not easily be recognized, and villagers might struggle to see whether that person carried a weapon or had harmful intentions. A locked door therefore served as a protective barrier that prevented suspicious individuals from entering without warning. The presence of livestock within or near the home also encouraged villagers to secure their houses before sunset. Chickens, goats, and pigs were extremely valuable resources for rural families. They provided eggs, milk, meat, and other necessities that supported daily life. Because of their value, these animals were often kept close to the house or inside small attached shelters. Locking doors early helped ensure that predators or thieves could not easily reach these animals during the night. In addition, medieval villages often lacked consistent communication between households after dark. During the day, people could easily call out to neighbors across fields or streets. At night, however, darkness and distance made communication more difficult. If trouble occurred late at night, it might take time for others to notice or respond. Locking the door early reduced the chances that a family would need to rely on outside help during the most uncertain hours. Many homes also stored items that were essential for survival through the coming seasons. Barrels of grain, dried herbs, preserved foods, and handmade clothing were often kept within the household. These items represented months of labor and preparation. Losing them due to theft or damage could place a family in serious difficulty. Because of this, villagers treated the act of securing their homes as a crucial step in protecting their future well-being. Another subtle but important reason for locking doors before sunset was the human tendency to feel more anxious in darkness. Even when no real danger existed, the absence of light could make ordinary sounds seem threatening. The rustling of leaves, the movement of animals, or the creaking of wooden structures could easily startle someone awake during the night. Knowing that the door was securely locked helped calm these fears and allowed people to rest more peacefully. Village traditions also encouraged people to follow this habit together. When most households closed their doors at roughly the same time, it created a shared sense of routine across the entire community. The village gradually became quiet as evening progressed, and people respected the privacy of others during the nighttime hours. This collective behavior strengthened the feeling that everyone was cooperating to maintain safety. Another reason villagers secured their homes early involved the natural limitations of medieval lighting. Candles and oil lamps were expensive and often used sparingly. Most families could not afford to keep many lights burning throughout the night. As a result, the interior of the house was only dimly lit once darkness fell. Trying to secure doors or shutters under such low light conditions would have been inconvenient and potentially ineffective. Completing the task before sunset ensured that it was done properly. The habit also helped families establish a calm and predictable evening routine. After the door was locked and the shutters closed, people could shift their attention from work to rest. Meals were finished. The fire was adjusted to burn safely through the night, and bedding was prepared. This structured transition from daytime activity to nighttime rest helped villagers maintain both physical health and mental balance. Children growing up in medieval villages quickly became familiar with this pattern. They saw their parents perform the same tasks each evening and understood that these actions protected the household. Over time, they learned to take part in the routine themselves, helping close shutters or checking that animals were secured. These responsibilities taught them discipline and awareness from a young age. The symbolic meaning of the locked door was also important. It represented a boundary between the controlled environment of the home and the unpredictable world outside. Within the home, families shared warmth, food, and companionship. Outside, darkness covered the landscape and reduced visibility, creating conditions where danger could more easily hide. Even though medieval villagers did not possess modern technology or organized security systems, they relied on practical wisdom developed through experience. They knew that small, consistent actions could significantly reduce risk. Locking the door before sunset was one of the simplest yet most effective habits they practiced. As the stars began to appear in the sky and the village settled into silence, the securely closed doors stood as quiet guardians of each household. Behind those doors, families slept, protected by the routines that had been passed down through generations. The act of locking a door before sunset may have seemed simple, but it reflected a deep understanding of the challenges that came with life in a world where darkness brought both mystery and potential danger. Through this nightly ritual, medieval villagers created a fragile but meaningful sense of safety. By preparing their homes before nightfall, they ensured that when darkness finally arrived, they could face it from within the comfort and protection of their own walls. As twilight slowly spread across the fields and narrow paths of a medieval village, the community instinctively moved toward its nightly routine of protection and rest. The fading sunlight was more than just the end of a working day. It was a signal that the world outside the home was about to become far less predictable. Without artificial lighting, organized security, or reliable emergency help, villagers relied on simple habits to maintain safety. Among these habits, locking the door before sunset remained one of the most consistent and important practices in everyday life. The landscape surrounding most medieval villages played a major role in shaping this behavior. Many settlements were located near forests, rivers, hills, or open farmland. During the day, these areas were essential for gathering resources such as wood, water, and game. At night, however, the same landscapes became difficult to see and control. Anyone or anything moving through those areas could approach the village unnoticed. Because of this uncertainty, villagers preferred to secure their homes early rather than risk being exposed to whatever might emerge from the darkness. Another important factor was the slow pace of communication during medieval times. If a dangerous group of travelers, raiders, or criminals had been seen in nearby regions, news might take days to reach distant villages. By the time word arrived, the threat could already be nearby. Locking doors before sunset was therefore a precaution that did not rely on warnings or announcements. It was a constant habit that protected households regardless of whether danger was known or suspected. The emotional comfort provided by a secured door was also deeply valued. Medieval life involved many uncertainties, from unpredictable harvests to outbreaks of illness. While villagers could not control every challenge they faced, they could at least ensure that their homes were properly protected at night. Sliding a wooden bolt across the door or securing a heavy latch gave families a reassuring sense that they had taken responsibility for their own safety. Even simple environmental conditions reinforced this habit. As the sun set, shadows stretched across the ground and familiar shapes slowly disappeared into darkness. Houses, fences, and trees that were clearly visible during the day became vague outlines at night. The human eye struggled to recognize details in such conditions. Because of this, villagers did not want to leave doors unsecured while waiting for complete darkness to arrive. Locking them early ensured that protection was already in place when visibility became poor. In many villages, the evening routine unfolded almost like a carefully practiced sequence. Farmers returned from the fields carrying tools or baskets of produce. Animals were guided into pens or shelters close to the house. Firewood was brought inside to keep the hearth burning through the night. After these tasks were finished, someone in the household would close the door firmly and fasten the locking bar. Once this step was completed, the outside world was effectively shut away until morning. As the sun slowly dipped below the horizon in a medieval village, the fading light carried a clear message to everyone who lived there. The safe and productive hours of the day were ending. Villagers had long understood that daylight offered protection simply because it allowed people to see what was happening around them. Fields, roads, and houses were visible, and neighbors could easily recognize each other. But as evening approached and shadows stretched across the ground, that sense of clarity began to disappear. Locking doors before sunset became one of the most reliable ways to maintain safety once visibility was lost. In many villages, daily life followed the rhythm of the sun almost perfectly. People woke at dawn, worked through the daylight hours, and gradually slowed their activities as the evening approached. This natural cycle meant that sunset was not a sudden moment, but a gradual transition that everyone paid attention to. Villagers used the changing color of the sky as a signal to complete their remaining tasks and return home. By the time the sun touched the horizon, most households were already preparing to secure their doors. An important reason for this habit was the uncertainty of rural travel during medieval times. Roads were rarely well maintained and often passed through forests or empty stretches of land. Travelers who were delayed or lost might reach a village after dark, but villagers could not easily determine whether such visitors were trustworthy. Because strangers could pose a risk, many households preferred to lock their doors early, rather than deal with unfamiliar people arriving unexpectedly in the night. The simple design of medieval locks also influenced when doors were secured. Unlike modern locks that can be opened or closed easily with keys, many medieval doors relied on heavy wooden bars, iron hooks, or sliding bolts placed on the inside. These mechanisms worked well, but required careful handling. Villagers preferred to secure them, while there was still enough light to see clearly, and ensure everything was firmly in place. Even the sounds of evening played a role in shaping this routine. As daylight faded, the lively noise of work and conversation gradually gave way to quieter natural sounds. Birds settled into trees, insects began their nighttime activity, and the wind rustled through crops or leaves. In this quiet environment, unusual noises could stand out sharply. The knowledge that the door was already locked helped villagers remain calm if they heard movement outside during the night. Another important reason for locking doors early was the need to protect stored resources. Medieval households carefully preserved food supplies that had taken months to grow or prepare. Grain harvested from fields, vegetables from gardens, and meat preserved through drying or smoking were often stored inside the house or nearby structures. These supplies were essential for surviving difficult seasons, especially winter. By locking their doors before sunset, villagers reduced the chances that thieves might gain access to these valuable stores. The evening routine often became a shared family activity. One person might bring in tools from outside, while another gathered firewood. Someone else might close the wooden shutters over small windows to keep out wind and cold. Finally, the door would be shut and secured with its latch or beam. This sequence of actions ensured that everything the family depended on was protected before nightfall. Another reason for early security was the unpredictability of weather. In many regions, sudden rain or strong winds could arrive during the evening. Once darkness settled in, it became much harder to move around outside safely in poor weather. Securing the home before sunset ensured that villagers did not need to step out into potentially dangerous conditions later in the night. Social habits within villages also encouraged people to follow the same routine. Since most families locked their doors around the same time each evening, it created a shared sense of order throughout the community. The village gradually became quiet as households settled indoors. Anyone wandering outside late at night might attract attention simply because it was unusual behavior. For children growing up in medieval villages, this routine quickly became part of their understanding of daily life. They learned that the evening sky was a signal to return home and help prepare the house for the night. Watching adults secure the door and close shutters taught them that safety required attention and discipline. Over time, these lessons became habits they carried into adulthood. The interior of a medieval house often felt especially comforting once the door had been locked. The hearth fire provided warmth and light, creating a soft glow that filled the room. Family members gathered close together, sharing food and conversation after the day's work. With the door secured, the house felt like a protected space separate from the darkness outside. The act of locking the door also had symbolic meaning. It marked the boundary between the familiar world of family and the unpredictable world beyond the walls of the house. Outside were forests, roads, and distant travelers whose intentions were unknown. Inside were loved ones, shared responsibilities, and the quiet routines that gave structure to everyday life. Many villagers believed that careful preparation was the key to surviving the uncertainties of their time. Locking doors before sunset was a small action, but it represented a mindset of caution and awareness. It showed that families understood the risks of nighttime and were determined to reduce those risks whenever possible. Even when nothing dangerous happened, the routine remained important because it reinforced discipline and responsibility. Each evening repeated the same pattern that had been followed for generations. People trusted these habits because they had proven effective over many years. As darkness finally covered the village, and the stars appeared overhead, the narrow paths between houses grew silent. Doors remained firmly closed, shutters sealed the windows, and the only light came from small hearth fires glowing within homes. Behind those doors, families rested, confident that they had taken the necessary steps to protect themselves through the night. Through this simple practice, medieval villagers created a sense of security in a world that often lacked reliable protection. Locking their doors before sunset allowed them to face the long hours of darkness with greater peace of mind, knowing that the boundary between their home and the outside world had been firmly secured. As the day slowly faded into evening in a medieval village, the familiar rhythm of life guided everyone toward the same quiet preparation. The fading sunlight acted almost like a natural clock that signaled it was time to return home and secure the household. Medieval people did not rely on watches or modern schedules. Instead, they observed the sky, the position of the sun, and the length of shadows stretching across the ground. When those shadows grew long and the sky began to dim, villagers knew that the time had come to finish outdoor work and prepare their homes for the night. Locking doors before sunset was part of a much larger routine that helped families transition from the busy hours of labor into the stillness of night. Throughout the day, homes were often left open while people moved in and out freely. Children played nearby, neighbors visited one another, and animals wandered through the village paths. But as evening approached, that openness gradually disappeared. The village slowly shifted from activity to quiet caution. One of the reasons this change happened so early was because darkness arrived quickly once the sun dropped below the horizon. Without modern lighting, twilight lasted only a short time before the world became extremely dim. Villagers preferred to secure their homes, while there was still a small amount of daylight remaining. Waiting until complete darkness could make even simple tasks difficult. The roads and paths surrounding medieval villages were another reason. Doors were locked early. These paths connected communities across forests, hills, and fields. While they were useful during the day, they also allowed strangers to enter the village easily. Travelers might pass through looking for shelter, food, or directions. Some travelers were honest and harmless, but villagers could not always tell the difference between a peaceful visitor and someone with harmful intentions. By locking their doors before sunset, families avoided situations where they might be forced to decide whether to open their homes to strangers late at night. The structure of medieval society also encouraged households to rely heavily on themselves for protection. Unlike modern communities with police forces or emergency services, medieval villages had very limited organized security. Some larger towns had watchmen, but small rural settlements often depended entirely on personal caution and cooperation between neighbors. Locking the door early was one of the simplest ways for a family to create its own sense of security. Another important reason for this practice involved the natural vulnerability people felt once daylight disappeared. Humans rely heavily on sight, and when visibility is reduced, the ability to recognize danger is weakened. In the darkness, someone approaching a house might not be recognized until they were already very close. Locking the door before sunset meant that this potential risk was already addressed before nightfall made observation difficult. Villagers were also careful to protect the tools and equipment they relied on for survival. Farming tools, baskets, knives, and other items were often stored inside the house after the day's work. As the evening deepened across a medieval village, the quiet preparation for night continued to follow patterns that had been repeated for generations. Villagers did not view locking their doors before sunset as an unusual precaution. To them it was simply a normal part of responsible living. Life during that time required people to think ahead, anticipate potential problems, and act before those problems had a chance to arise. Securing the home before darkness was one of the simplest yet most reliable ways to maintain control over their surroundings. The environment around a medieval village could change quickly once daylight faded. During the day, the countryside felt open and manageable. Farmers could see the boundaries of their fields, travellers could follow roads, and neighbours could easily recognize one another. But once darkness arrived, the same familiar spaces could become disorienting. Without artificial lighting, even a short distance from the house could feel uncertain. Villagers preferred to complete all outdoor tasks before sunset, so that once the door was locked, they would not need to venture outside again. Another reason for this habit involved the limitations of medieval vision at night. Although moonlight sometimes illuminated the landscape, it was not reliable. Cloudy nights could leave the entire village in near total darkness. In such conditions, it became extremely difficult to recognize faces or identify movements in the distance. A person approaching a house could not easily be identified until they were very close. Locking the door early ensured that this vulnerability was addressed before darkness fully settled. Medieval villagers were also aware that the night often attracted people who wished to remain unnoticed. Individuals involved in theft or other wrongdoing preferred darkness, because it allowed them to move quietly without drawing attention. Even if such individuals rarely appeared in a particular village, the possibility remained. A door that had already been locked before sunset made it far more difficult for anyone to test whether a house was accessible. The evening also marked the time when villagers began preserving the energy they would need for the next day. Physical labour during the medieval period was exhausting, and rest was essential for maintaining strength. By locking the door early and completing their responsibilities before nightfall, families avoided unnecessary stress or interruptions that might disturb their rest. In addition to protecting against people, securing the house early helped keep unwanted animals out. Rural villages were surrounded by wildlife that often became more active after dark. Foxes, stray dogs, and other animals might wander close to homes in search of food. If doors were left open too long, these animals could easily slip inside or cause damage to stored supplies. Closing and locking the door before sunset helped prevent these disturbances. The practice also had a social dimension. Because most families followed similar evening routines, the entire village gradually settled into quiet at roughly the same time. This shared behavior created a strong sense of order and cooperation. When everyone respected the same pattern of securing their homes early, the community as a whole became safer. Another reason villagers locked their doors before sunset was the importance of safeguarding their household authority. In medieval culture, the head of the household carried responsibility for protecting family members and property. Ensuring that the door was properly secured each evening was part of fulfilling that duty. It demonstrated vigilance and care for those living under the same roof. Inside the home, the moment the door was locked often marked a shift in atmosphere. The busy energy of daytime work gave way to the calm of evening life. The hearth fire became the centre of the household, casting warm light across the room. Families gathered together to eat, talk, or complete small tasks that required less effort than daytime labour. The quiet of the evening allowed people to reflect on the events of the day and plan for the next one. Farmers might discuss weather conditions or decide which fields to work in the morning. Others might repair clothing, sharpen tools, or prepare supplies for the following day. All of this took place within the protective boundary created by the locked door. For children, the evening routine provided both comfort and structure. They knew that once the door was secured, the household had entered its safe nighttime state. Parents often used this time to teach lessons, tell stories, or share family traditions. These moments strengthened the bonds within the household and helped younger generations understand the importance of responsibility and caution. The practice of locking doors early also reflected a broader awareness of the natural world. Medieval villagers lived closely connected to their environment. They observed the movement of animals, the patterns of weather, and the changing seasons. They understood that nighttime belonged to a different rhythm of life, one in which humans were not always the dominant presence. Securing their homes before sunset was a way of acknowledging and respecting that reality. Even when danger was unlikely, the habit continued because it was simple and effective. A few moments spent closing and bolting the door could prevent many possible problems. Over centuries, this small action became part of the shared wisdom of rural communities. As darkness finally settled over the village, and the sky filled with stars, the narrow paths between houses grew silent. Each home stood closed, and still, its door firmly secured against the outside world. Within those walls, families rested peacefully, trusting in the routines that had protected them night after night. In the end, the practice of locking doors before sunset was not just about fear or suspicion. It was about preparation, discipline, and the desire to maintain safety in a world where people depended largely on themselves and their neighbors. Through this simple nightly action, medieval villagers created a sense of stability that allowed them to face the long hours of darkness with confidence and calm. As evening slowly approached in a medieval village, the fading sunlight signaled that the familiar safety of the day was beginning to disappear. People living during that time understood that darkness transformed their surroundings in ways that made daily life far more uncertain. Without streetlights, lanterns along roads, or organized protection, the night belonged to shadows, limited visibility, and unknown possibilities. Locking doors before sunset therefore became a deeply ingrained habit that helped families protect themselves before those uncertainties arrived. In many villages, the approach of sunset could be felt in the gradual slowing of activity. Farmers working in distant fields began gathering their tools and leading animals back toward barns or small shelters near their homes. Craftsmen closed their workshops and stored away the materials they had been using during the day. Market stalls that had been filled with conversation and trade earlier in the afternoon slowly emptied as people carried their purchases home. All of this movement reflected an understanding that evening preparation was just as important as the work that came before it. Another reason villagers locked their doors early was the difficulty of recognizing danger once daylight disappeared. Human eyesight depends heavily on light to distinguish shapes and movement clearly. When the sun set, the world quickly lost detail and color. A figure walking down a village path might appear only as a shadow, making it difficult to tell whether the person was a neighbor or a stranger. By securing doors before darkness, villagers avoided the need to make uncertain decisions about who might be approaching their homes. The materials used to build medieval houses also influenced how seriously people treated nighttime security. Many homes were made of wood, clay, straw, and other natural materials that were strong enough to provide shelter, but not designed to resist forced entry for long periods. Because of this, villagers relied on early preparation rather than waiting to react to a problem. A door that was properly closed and reinforced before nightfall made it much harder for someone to attempt entry unnoticed. Villagers were also aware that nighttime encouraged secrecy. Individuals who intended to steal or cause trouble preferred darkness because it allowed them to move quietly without being recognized. Even if such incidents were uncommon, people did not take unnecessary chances. Locking the door early sent a clear message that the household was alert and prepared. In addition to human threats, the rural environment itself required caution. Villages were often surrounded by forests or large open fields where animals lived and hunted. During the day, those animals usually avoided human activity, but at night they sometimes moved closer to settlements searching for food. Wolves, foxes, and other creatures could wander through the outskirts of villages, especially during harsh seasons when food was scarce. A securely locked door ensured that families remained protected from these encounters. The evening routine within a household usually followed a clear order. After returning home, family members gathered any belongings that had been left outside during the day. Tools were brought indoors, animals were fed, and water was collected for cooking or cleaning. Once these tasks were finished, the door was closed and secured with a wooden beam or latch. This final action signaled that the household was ready to settle in for the night. Inside the home, the atmosphere changed immediately after the door was locked. The outside world became distant, and the focus shifted. As the last traces of daylight faded across the rooftops and fields of a medieval village, the simple act of securing a door carried a sense of finality for the day. For villagers, sunset was more than just a beautiful moment in the sky. It was the natural signal that the outside world would soon become harder to manage. With darkness approaching, people instinctively shifted their attention from work and movement to protection and rest. Locking the door before sunset was one of the most important parts of that transition. Many medieval villagers believed that preparation before nightfall was far wiser than reacting to problems in the dark. Once the sun had disappeared and the sky turned black, responding to unexpected situations became far more difficult. A person trying to secure their home after darkness had already settled might struggle to see whether the latch was properly fastened or whether the door had been closed tightly. By locking the door while there was still light in the sky, families ensured that everything was secure before the challenges of night arrived. Another reason villagers followed this practice was the natural vulnerability people felt once their surroundings could no longer be clearly seen. During the day, neighbours working in nearby fields or walking through village paths created a sense of shared presence. At night, however, those familiar faces disappeared into their homes, and the village streets became quiet and empty. Without the watchful presence of others, each household became responsible for its own safety. The early locking of doors also helped villagers manage the uncertainty of rural travel. Roads between settlements were often long and passed through isolated landscapes. Travellers sometimes arrived late, searching for shelter or assistance. While some villages might offer help to a traveller during daylight hours, an unexpected knock on the door after dark created anxiety. Locking doors before sunset helped reduce these situations by making it clear that households were no longer receiving visitors. The physical design of medieval villages also contributed to this habit. Houses were usually built close together along narrow paths, with only a few entrances leading into each dwelling. This meant that the front door was the primary barrier between the household and the outside world. Once that door was secured, the house effectively became a small protected space within the larger village. Villagers were also aware that the darkness of night could make ordinary problems seem much more serious. A loose animal wandering near the house, a branch scratching against the wall, or footsteps along a nearby path could easily startle someone awake. Knowing that the door had already been locked allowed families to rest more calmly, confident that whatever sounds they heard outside could not easily reach them. Another factor that encouraged early door locking was the value placed on order and routine. Medieval life was shaped by patterns that repeated each day and each season. Farmers planted crops at certain times of year, harvested them at others, and performed daily tasks in predictable sequences. Locking the door before sunset fit naturally into this system of routines. It marked the closing of the day just as clearly as the rising sun marked its beginning. The importance of fire inside the home also played a role in evening preparations. The hearth was the center of the house, providing warmth, light, and the ability to cook meals. Once the door and shutters were closed, the household environment became more stable, allowing the fire to burn safely without strong drafts from outside winds. This made the home more comfortable and reduced the risk of sparks spreading through the wooden structure. Village animals further influenced this practice. Dogs often stayed near homes and would bark if strangers or animals approached during the night. Chickens, goats, or pigs might be kept in small enclosures close to the house. Locking doors early ensured that these animals remained protected and that predators could not easily reach them. Even the social culture of medieval villages supported the idea that night was a time for privacy and rest. After sunset, most people expected others to remain within their homes unless there was an emergency. This shared understanding meant that nighttime disturbances were rare, and locking the door early helped maintain this peaceful rhythm. Inside the house, the atmosphere became noticeably different once the door was secured. The warm glow of the hearth filled the room while the outside world faded into darkness. Families often spent this time talking quietly, repairing clothing, or preparing simple items for the next day's work. These calm evening hours provided a chance to rest both body and mind after long periods of physical labor. Children also learned to associate the locking of the door with the safety of being home. Parents used this moment to remind them that nighttime was not a time for wandering outside. Over time, these lessons shaped how younger generations approached responsibility and caution. The door itself gradually became a symbol of protection. It separated two very different environments: the unpredictable darkness beyond the village paths, and the small but secure world inside the household. Each evening when the door was bolted, it represented the family's effort to maintain control over their own safety. Over centuries, this simple habit became so normal that it required no explanation among villagers. Everyone understood that securing the home before sunset was a wise precaution that had protected families for generations. It was part of the quiet knowledge that people shared about how to live safely in a world where help was not always close at hand. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, the village grew still. The paths between houses were empty, and only the faint glow of hearth fires showed that people were inside. Behind each locked door families slept, trusting in the small but meaningful routines that helped them endure the uncertainties of medieval life. In this way, the act of locking doors before sunset was not just a defensive measure, but a reflection of the careful mindset that defined village life. It showed how people adapted to their environment, respected the natural cycle of day and night, and relied on discipline and preparation to create a sense of security in a world where darkness often brought both mystery and risk. As evening approached in a medieval village, the gradual dimming of the sky signaled more than just the end of another day's work. It reminded villagers that their surroundings were about to change in ways that made ordinary life less predictable. During the daylight hours, the village felt open, familiar, and cooperative. People could see their neighbours working in nearby fields, hear conversations along the paths, and recognise anyone walking through the settlement. But as the sun dipped closer to the horizon, the certainty that came with daylight slowly faded. Locking doors before sunset became one of the most dependable ways to maintain control over that changing environment. Villagers often noticed how quickly darkness could take over once the sun had fully set. Twilight in rural areas could pass rapidly, especially on cloudy evenings when the fading light disappeared even sooner. Without artificial lighting to extend the day, people knew that once night arrived it would become extremely difficult to see more than a few steps ahead. Securing doors before sunset meant that households were already protected by the time darkness fully covered the village. The natural environment surrounding medieval villages also encouraged early preparation. Fields stretched beyond the houses, and forests or hills were often not far away. During the day, those areas were sources of food, wood, and other resources. At night, they became quiet and shadowed spaces where movement was difficult to detect. Animals that avoided human activity during the day sometimes moved closer to villages after dark, and travellers passing through the countryside could appear suddenly. By locking their doors early, villagers ensured that these unpredictable nighttime visitors could not easily reach their homes. Another reason for this habit was the limited ability to solve problems in darkness. If something went wrong outside the house after sunset, responding to it required lanterns or torches that provided only a small amount of light. Moving around with such lighting was slow and sometimes dangerous. Villagers preferred to finish their outdoor responsibilities before sunset, so that once their doors were locked, they would not need to deal with unexpected tasks outside. The early securing of homes also protected the quiet rhythm of nighttime life. After a full day of work, people needed rest in order to continue their responsibilities the following morning. Locking the door before sunset helped create a peaceful environment inside the home, where families could relax without worrying about disturbances from outside. In many households, the door was secured using a strong wooden bar placed across the inside. This type of lock was simple but effective, and once it was in place, the door could not easily be opened from the outside. Placing the bar required careful attention, and villagers preferred to do it while they could still see clearly. If they waited until it was completely dark, they might struggle to position it correctly. The quietness of the village at night also made early preparation important. Once most households had closed their doors, the settlement became very still. In that silence, even a small sound could travel far. Footsteps, creaking wood, or the movement of animals might be heard from across the village.